Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind and step gently into the dusty libraries of a desert city, where scholars once debated beneath mud brick walls, where manuscripts filled with golden calligraphy preserved the wisdom of civilizations, and where knowledge itself was the most precious commodity. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the lives lived, the ideas cherished, the truth that Africa's greatest cities were built not just on gold but on words. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There is a place in the Sahara Desert where the sand meets the river, where camel caravans once arrived bearing salt from the northern mines and departed laden with gold from the southern kingdoms, where mud brick buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, where the call to prayer echoed 5 times daily across a city that held more books than most of medieval Europe combined. This place is Timbuktu, and at its height, in the 15th and 16th centuries, it was not just a trading post or a distant outpost on the edge of nowhere. It was a centre of learning, a beacon of scholarship, a university city where students came from across Africa and the Islamic world to study law and theology, astronomy and mathematics, medicine and poetry. When Europeans first heard tales of Timbuktu, they imagined a city of gold, a place where wealth beyond measure lay waiting to be claimed. They were wrong, but not in the way they thought. Timbuktu's wealth was not in its buildings or its treasuries. It was in its libraries, in the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts carefully copied by scribes, preserved in private collections, passed down through families for generations. These manuscripts, written in Arabic and local languages, covered every subject imaginable: religious commentaries and legal treatises, astronomical tables and mathematical proofs, historical chronicles and love poetry, medical remedies and mystical teachings. The city itself was built of mud, of clay and straw baked in the sun, shaped into bricks and stacked into walls, plastered smooth and painted white or left natural brown. It was not impressive by the standards of stone architecture, not grand like the cathedrals of Europe or the mosques of Cairo, but it was perfectly adapted to its environment, to the scorching days and cool nights, to the sandstorms that could bury entire neighbourhoods, to the annual floods, when the Niger River overflowed its banks and turned the desert temporarily green. The buildings, especially the great mosques like Djingareba and Sankore, were functional and beautiful, with wooden beams protruding from walls like the quills of a porcupine, designed to support scaffolding for the constant replastering required in a city built from earth. But the real architecture of Timbuktu was intellectual. The city was organised around 3 great mosques that doubled as universities, where scholars taught students who sat on the floors of courtyards, memorising texts, debating interpretations, copying manuscripts to take home. The libraries, some public but most private, held collections that rivaled the great libraries of the Islamic world. A single scholar might own thousands of books, and there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of such scholars in Timbuktu at its peak. How does a city like this emerge in the middle of the desert? How does a place with no stone, no major natural resources except the river, no agricultural surplus to speak of, become a centre of learning that attracted scholars from Baghdad and Cairo, from Mecca and Marrakesh? And why, when European explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, did they find not gold but decaying manuscripts, not wealth but poverty, not the mythical city of legend, but a dusty town that seemed to confirm their prejudices about African backwardness? These questions have answers, but the answers complicate our understanding of African history, of Islamic scholarship, of what counts as civilization and who gets to define it. Timbuktu was real, and at its height, it was extraordinary, but it has been obscured by myths, both the European myth of golden streets and the later myth that Africa had no intellectual tradition, no cities of learning, no contributions to world knowledge. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet, as your mind drifts towards sleep, We are going to walk through Timbuktu not as it appears in legends or in its current diminished state, but as it was when it thrived, when the streets were filled with students and merchants, when scribes worked by lamplight copying texts, when scholars debated in mosque courtyards, when books were more valuable than gold. We are going to meet the people who built this city of knowledge, who dedicated their lives to learning and teaching, who believed that education was the highest calling, that preserving wisdom was a sacred duty. And we're going to confront the uncomfortable truth that this city, this achievement, was largely written out of history, dismissed or ignored by a world that could not or would not acknowledge that Africans had created centres of learning, that black scholars had mastered astronomy and law, that the Sahara was not a barrier but a highway, that civilization bloomed in the desert as surely as it bloomed anywhere else. Timbuktu is not just a historical curiosity, not just an exotic name on a map. It is a challenge to how we think about knowledge and who creates it, about what we remember and what we forget, about the stories we tell ourselves about civilization and progress. The manuscripts still exist, tens of thousands of them rescued from recent extremist violence, stored in libraries and private collections, slowly being catalogued and digitized, revealing secrets that have been hidden for centuries. So let us begin. Let us walk through the sandy streets of Timbuktu when the mud brick buildings were fresh, when the markets buzzed with languages from a dozen lands, when the libraries held treasures more precious than any metal, when knowledge itself was the currency that mattered most. The journey is long, but it is worth taking, because at the end of it, you will understand something essential about human achievement, about how learning transcends geography and race, about how even in the most unlikely places, given the right circumstances, people will gather to read and write and think and argue, to preserve the past and imagine the future, to be fully, gloriously human. Welcome to Timbuktu. Welcome to the city of scholars. Before there was Timbuktu, before there were scholars and manuscripts, before there were mosques rising from the sand, there was the river and the desert, two forces locked in eternal tension, one bringing life, the other threatening to overwhelm it. The Niger River, the third longest in Africa, flows northeast from the highlands of Guinea, then curves east and south in a great arc through what is now Mali, creating a vast inland delta where water spreads across the land, sustaining fish and crops, supporting towns and villages. And surrounding this ribbon of life is the Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth, an ocean of sand and stone that stretches from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. West Africa in the 11th and 12th centuries was a world shaped by this geography, by the relationship between desert and river, between the trading towns along the Niger and the kingdoms of the south. This was the age of the Ghana Empire, though not the Ghana of today, but an older kingdom located in what is now Mali and Mauritania, a state that controlled the gold trade from the forests of the south and the salt trade from the Saharan mines of the north. Ghana was powerful, wealthy, organized, but it was beginning to decline, weakened by drought and invasion, soon to be replaced by new powers, new kingdoms that would build on its foundations. The people of the region were diverse, speaking different languages, following different traditions, but increasingly unified by Islam, which had spread across North Africa and was now moving south, carried by traders and scholars, by merchants who found that sharing a religion made business easier, by kings who saw in Islam a source of legitimacy and a connection to the wider world. The conversion was gradual, often superficial at first, blending Islamic practices with older beliefs, creating a syncretic culture that was distinctively West African. The trans-Saharan trade was ancient, older than Islam, older than any written records. For thousands of years, people had crossed the desert, following routes marked by oases and wells, navigating by stars and landmarks, moving goods between the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa. But the introduction of the camel, sometime in the first millennium, revolutionized this trade, making it possible to cross the desert in weeks rather than months, to carry heavier loads, to establish regular routes. The goods that moved along these routes were specific and essential. From the south came gold, extracted from mines in what is now Ghana and Ivory Coast, panned from rivers, traded through networks of middlemen until it reached the desert's edge. From the north came salt, mined in places like Tagaza, where workers laboured in brutal conditions to extract slabs of salt that were literally worth their weight in gold in the south, where salt was scarce and essential for preserving food and maintaining health. Also from the north came manufactured goods, cloth and metalwork, books and paper, luxury items that West African kings desired. And along these trade routes, at strategic points where goods were transferred from one caravan to another, trading towns emerged. Timbuktu was one of these, founded sometime around 1100 by Tuareg nomads, who recognized the site's advantages. It was located where the Niger River came closest to the desert, where boats travelling on the river could meet caravans crossing the Sahara, where goods could be stored, where travellers could rest and resupply. Initially, it was modest, a seasonal camp that grew into a permanent settlement, attracting merchants and their families, artisans and labourers, all the people necessary to support trade. But trade alone does not create a city of learning. For that, you need something more: patronage, stability, a critical mass of educated people, and a culture that values knowledge. These elements came together in Timbuktu gradually, over generations, as the city grew wealthier and as Islam became more established. Muslim scholars needed books, needed places to study and teach, needed support from wealthy patrons who saw funding education as a religious duty, a way to gain merit, to ensure the proper practice of Islam, to raise their own status. The Mali Empire, which succeeded Ghana as the dominant power in the region, provided the stability and patronage Timbuktu needed to flourish. The Mali kings, particularly Mansa Musa in the 14th century, were devout Muslims who saw Islam not just as a religion but as a civilization, a way of connecting to a wider world, to the great centers of learning in Cairo and Baghdad, to the intellectual traditions of Islamic scholarship. They invited scholars to their courts, built mosques and schools, encouraged learning, and made Timbuktu a center of their efforts. The climate, harsh as it was, had advantages for scholarship. The desert air, extremely dry, was perfect for preserving manuscripts. Paper, which deteriorates quickly in humidity, could last for centuries in Timbuktu's climate. The mud brick buildings, with their thick walls, provided cool interiors where scholars could work even in the heat of the day. The isolation, the fact that Timbuktu was difficult to reach, protected it from some of the conflicts that plagued more accessible cities, gave it periods of stability where intellectual work could flourish uninterrupted. This was the world before Timbuktu became famous, a world of caravans and riverboats, of traders haggling in marketplaces, of kings seeking legitimacy through religion, of scholars teaching small groups of students in mosque courtyards. It was a world on the edge of transformation, where the pieces were falling into place for something extraordinary to emerge, where gold and salt and faith and knowledge were about to combine in ways that would create one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The foundation was being laid, the conditions prepared, the stage set for Timbuktu's golden age. The European discovery of Timbuktu was a story of obsession, of men risking death to reach a city that existed more in imagination than in any accurate understanding of reality. For centuries, Europeans had heard rumours of a fabulously wealthy city somewhere in the interior of Africa, a place where gold was so plentiful that buildings were covered in it, where kings dined from golden plates, where wealth beyond measure waited for anyone brave or foolish enough to reach it. These rumours were not entirely baseless. They originated from accounts of Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, when the Mali emperor travelled with an entourage so large and so lavish that he distributed so much gold in Cairo that he temporarily destabilized the Egyptian economy. European merchants and travellers heard these stories, heard about Mali and its capital Timbuktu, and their imaginations filled in the blanks, creating a mythical city that bore little resemblance to reality. The first European to claim to have reached Timbuktu was probably a fiction. Various travellers in the 16th and 17th centuries claimed to have visited the city, but their accounts were vague, contradictory, probably fabricated to gain fame or funding. The truth was that Timbuktu was extraordinarily difficult for Europeans to reach. It was thousands of miles from the coast, across desert, or through hostile territory, and the local rulers had no interest in allowing Christian foreigners into their domains. But in the 19th century, as European powers began to seriously explore and colonize Africa, the race to reach Timbuktu became an obsession. The British and French offered rewards to anyone who could reach the city and return with accurate information. Dozens of men tried. Most died of disease or thirst, or were killed by raiders or hostile communities who had no reason to trust European intentions. In 1826, a British officer named Alexander Gordon Lying became the first European to verifiably reach Timbuktu. He approached from the north, crossing the Sahara with a Tuareg caravan, arriving in the city exhausted and ill. He stayed for 5 weeks, long enough to observe and record details, but his notes were cautious, almost disappointing. Timbuktu was not the golden city of legend. It was made of mud, its wealth diminished by political instability and shifts in trade routes. Lying left Timbuktu hoping to reach the coast, but he was murdered shortly after departing, likely by his Tuareg guides. His journals reached Europe, but they were incomplete, leaving more questions than answers. 2 years later, a French explorer named René Callier succeeded where Lying had failed. Callier was not a soldier or an officer. He was a working-class adventurer, obsessed with Africa, who learned Arabic and studied Islam, disguised himself as an Egyptian Muslim returning from travels, and joined a caravan travelling to Timbuktu. He reached the city in April 1828 and stayed for 2 weeks, observing, taking notes in secret, all while maintaining his disguise. When Callier finally returned to France and published his account, the European public was stunned, but not in the way they expected. Timbuktu was not golden. It was poor, declining, a shadow of its former self. Callier described mud brick houses, sandy streets, a city that seemed unimpressive, almost primitive. The European imagination, primed for splendour, felt cheated. Some accused Callier of lying, of never having reached the city at all. Others concluded that Timbuktu had always been a myth, that the stories of African wealth and learning were exaggerations or fabrications. But Callier had reached Timbuktu at its nadir, not its peak. By the 1820s, the city had been in decline for more than 2 centuries. The Songhai Empire, which had made Timbuktu a centre of learning in the 15th and 16th centuries, had fallen to Moroccan invasion in 1591. Trade routes had shifted, political instability and warfare had driven away merchants and scholars. The libraries, once filled with thousands of manuscripts, were now dispersed, hidden in private homes to protect them from raiders and invaders. What Callier saw was the remnant of greatness, not greatness itself. The real discovery of Timbuktu, the understanding of what it had been at its height, would take much longer. It required patient scholarship, the study of manuscripts that had survived, the collection of oral histories, the careful reconstruction of a past that had been obscured by decline and by European prejudice. In the early 20th century, French colonial scholars began to take Timbuktu seriously, to search for and catalogue manuscripts, to interview local families who had preserved books for generations. What they found was astonishing. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, written in Arabic and African languages, covering every conceivable subject. Legal commentaries and religious treatises, yes, but also astronomy and mathematics, medicine and chemistry, history and biography, poetry and mysticism. These were not crude or primitive texts. They were sophisticated works of scholarship, showing familiarity with classical Greek thought transmitted through Arabic translations, engagement with Islamic legal debates, original contributions to various fields. The discovery accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as digitization made it possible to catalogue and study the manuscripts more systematically. Researchers found texts proving that Timbuktu scholars had calculated the movements of planets, had developed original mathematical proofs, had written commentaries on Aristotle and Plato, had recorded local histories with remarkable detail. They found evidence of women scholars, of scientific debates, of a level of intellectual activity that rivaled the great universities of medieval Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. The discovery of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage was not a single moment, but a process that continues today. Every year, more manuscripts are found, rescued from decaying family libraries, brought to institutions where they can be preserved and studied. The discovery revealed that Timbuktu was not a myth and not a disappointment. It was real, it was extraordinary, and it had been hidden not by time alone, but by assumptions, by the refusal to believe that Africans could create centers of learning, by the erasure that comes when conquerors write history. The real discovery of Timbuktu was the recovery of a truth that had been there all along, waiting for the world to finally see it. When the manuscripts of Timbuktu began to be seriously studied in the 20th century, when European and African scholars started to grasp the scope and sophistication of the city's intellectual heritage, the response was complex, divided between wonder at what had been discovered and skepticism about whether it could really be as significant as it seemed. This skepticism was not entirely new. It echoed the response that greeted every revelation of African achievement, the same doubt that had surrounded Great Zimbabwe, the same reluctance to accept that black Africans had created sophisticated civilizations. The wonder was genuine enough. Scholars who examined the manuscripts, who read the astronomical tables and legal commentaries, who studied the poetry and the historical chronicles, could not help but be impressed. Here was proof, tangible and undeniable, that West Africa, in the 15th and 16th centuries, had a literate, sophisticated, intellectual culture, that Timbuktu had been a university city where serious scholarship occurred, where books were valued and preserved, where learning flourished. Some of the manuscripts were beautifully illuminated, with margins decorated in gold leaf, with elegant calligraphy that rivaled the finest Islamic manuscripts from anywhere in the world. Others were more utilitarian, copied quickly by students or local scribes, but even these showed familiarity with complex ideas, engagement with ongoing scholarly debates, participation in the wider Islamic intellectual world. The subjects covered were encyclopedic, Quranic interpretation and hadith studies, Islamic jurisprudence in multiple legal schools, Sufism and mystical theology, grammar and rhetoric, logic and philosophy, astronomy and astrology, mathematics and geometry, medicine and pharmacology, history and geography, poetry and literature. But alongside this wonder was skepticism, sometimes overt, more often subtle, embedded in the questions asked and the frameworks used to interpret the findings. Were these manuscripts really created in Timbuktu, or were they imports from North Africa or the Middle East? If they were created locally, were they original works, or just copies of texts from elsewhere? Did they represent genuine intellectual engagement, or mere rote learning, memorization without understanding? Were the scholars who produced them truly educated, or were they provincial imitators of cosmopolitan Islamic culture? These questions revealed deep-seated assumptions about African intellectual capacity, assumptions rooted in centuries of racist ideology. The idea that Africans could be consumers of knowledge, could copy and preserve texts created elsewhere, this was grudgingly accepted. But the idea that they could be producers of knowledge, could create original scholarship, could contribute to Islamic and world intellectual traditions, this was harder for many to swallow. The skepticism took various forms. Some scholars argued that Timbuktu's intellectual life was entirely derivative, that the city was at best a provincial outpost of the greater Islamic world, that whatever scholarship occurred there was second-rate, imitative, lacking the originality and sophistication of work produced in Cairo or Baghdad or Cordoba. This argument often failed to acknowledge that all intellectual traditions are derivative in some sense, that scholars everywhere build on work done elsewhere, that originality is relative and cumulative. Others question the scale of Timbuktu's achievement, arguing that while there might have been some learning, the claims of tens of thousands of manuscripts and hundreds of scholars were exaggerated, that Timbuktu had been inflated in importance by African nationalists eager to find sources of pride, by scholars overcorrecting for previous neglect. This skepticism often came from people who had not actually studied the manuscripts, who had not visited the libraries, who were judging from a distance based on assumptions rather than evidence. There was also aesthetic skepticism, a tendency to judge Timbuktu's intellectual output by inappropriate standards. European medieval universities had stone buildings, formal institutions, degree systems. Timbuktu's universities were informal, based in mosque courtyards, organized around individual scholars rather than institutions. European manuscripts were often elaborate, produced in scriptoria with specialized materials and techniques. Timbuktu's manuscripts were often more utilitarian, copied on local paper, bound simply. These differences were interpreted as signs of inferiority rather than adaptation to different circumstances and resources. But patient scholarly work gradually overcame much of this skepticism. Detailed studies of specific manuscripts proved that many were indeed original works, written by Timbuktu scholars, engaging with ideas in original ways, making contributions that were recognized by scholars elsewhere in the Islamic world. Comparisons with manuscripts from other centers showed that Timbuktu's level of scholarship was comparable to other provincial cities, that while it might not have produced as many towering geniuses as the greatest centers, it was a legitimate participant in Islamic intellectual life, not a pale imitation. Archaeological and historical research confirmed the scale of Timbuktu's scholarly community. Records showed that at its height, the city had more than 150 Quranic schools, that the University of Sankore alone had 25,000 students at its peak, that there were libraries with thousands of volumes. These numbers might have been rounded or inflated, but even if reduced, they indicated a substantial intellectual community, a city where learning was valued and widely pursued. The African response to the manuscripts was different, characterized more by pride and recognition than by skepticism. For Malians and for Africans more broadly, the manuscripts confirmed what oral traditions had always maintained, that Timbuktu had been a great center of learning, that Africa had intellectual traditions worth preserving and celebrating. The manuscripts became symbols of African achievement, proof that the continent's history was not just about slavery and colonialism, but about creativity and scholarship. But there was also frustration, anger at how long this knowledge had been ignored or suppressed, at how European scholars had dismissed or overlooked evidence of African achievement, at how colonialism had stolen not just resources, but history itself. The manuscripts revealed not just what Timbuktu had been, but what had been taken from Africa, not just material wealth, but the recognition of intellectual capacity, the acknowledgement of full humanity. The first response to Timbuktu's manuscripts, then, was a microcosm of the larger struggle over African history, a battle between those who wanted to maintain old hierarchies and those who insisted on a more honest, more complete account of human achievement. The wonder and the skepticism, both were real, both shaped how Timbuktu was understood and presented. And the work of sifting through these responses, of separating legitimate questions from prejudice, of building an accurate understanding based on evidence, this work continues. The legends about Timbuktu, the stories that circulated in Europe for centuries before any European reached the city, spoke of streets paved with gold, of roofs gleaming with precious metal, of markets where nuggets were traded like grain, of a wealth so extravagant it defied imagination. These were not entirely fabrications. They were distortions, exaggerations of something real, twisted through multiple retellings until the truth became unrecognizable. The reality was different, but no less remarkable. Timbuktu's wealth was not in gold, though gold certainly passed through the city. carried by caravans from the south, traded for salt and manufactured goods from the north. The city's merchants were wealthy, its kings commanded vast resources, its mosques were built and maintained through generous endowments. But the streets were sand, not gold. The buildings were mud brick, not marble. The real treasure of Timbuktu, the wealth that made it truly extraordinary, was something Europeans did not expect, and initially did not value: knowledge. According to local tradition, the city's golden age began with Mansa Musa's return from Mecca in 1325. The emperor, having seen the great centers of Islamic learning, having met scholars from across the Muslim world, was determined to transform Timbuktu into a comparable center. He brought back architects to build mosques. He invited scholars to settle in the city. He endowed libraries and schools. The tradition says that books became more valuable than any other commodity, that a scholar's library was his greatest asset, worth more than houses or livestock. This was true, but it contradicts the legend of material wealth. A city where books are the most valuable commodity is not a city of golden streets. It is a city of different priorities, different values, a place where intellectual capital matters more than material wealth. And this is what Timbuktu became: a city where a scholar with a large library commanded more respect than a merchant with large herds, where the ability to recite poetry or debate legal fine points brought more status than the ability to accumulate gold. The contradiction runs deeper. The legends portrayed Timbuktu as isolated, as a mysterious city hidden in the desert, unreachable and unknowable. The reality was that Timbuktu was extraordinarily connected, a cosmopolitan center where scholars from West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and even occasionally from as far as Persia and Central Asia came to study and teach. The city was a node in vast networks of trade and scholarship, a place where ideas and goods flowed from every direction. The students who came to Timbuktu studied with multiple teachers, moving between the three great mosque universities, Sankore, Jingareba, and Sidi Yahya, following scholars known for expertise in specific subjects. A student might study Quranic interpretation with one scholar, jurisprudence with another, astronomy with a third. This system was informal but sophisticated, based on personal relationships between teacher and student, on chains of transmission that connected contemporary scholars to the Prophet Muhammad through unbroken lines of teachers teaching students for generations. The legends also suggested that Timbuktu's wealth and learning appeared suddenly, miraculously, as if the city sprang fully formed from the desert. The reality was gradual development over centuries. The intellectual tradition built slowly as individual scholars attracted students, as libraries accumulated, as the city's reputation grew. By the 15th century, when Timbuktu reached its peak, it was the culmination of generations of effort, of knowledge carefully preserved and transmitted, of a culture that valued learning and invested resources in supporting it. But there is one legend that proves more true than Europeans expected: that Timbuktu's scholars preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. During the medieval period, while Europe was experiencing intellectual constriction, while religious authorities burned books and persecuted scholars, while much of classical learning was forgotten or suppressed, Timbuktu's libraries preserved texts that maintained continuity with ancient knowledge. Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle and Plato, survived in Arabic translations that were studied in Timbuktu alongside Islamic theology. Mathematical works from India and Persia were copied and commented upon. Medical texts from classical antiquity were preserved and expanded with local knowledge of African plants and remedies. The scholars of Timbuktu were not just passive preservers. They engaged actively with these texts, wrote commentaries, developed their own interpretations, contributed to ongoing scholarly conversations that stretched across continents. The contradiction between legend and reality is sharpest when we consider what happened when Europeans finally reached Timbuktu. They came expecting gold and found mud brick. They came expecting exotic barbarism and found learned scholars who had read books the Europeans had not. They came as supposed civilizers and found a civilization already present, one that in some ways surpassed their own in literacy and scholarly production. René Caillié, the French explorer who reached Timbuktu in 1828, expressed disappointment that the city was not more impressive physically. He could not see that the true monuments of Timbuktu were not buildings but books, not architecture but ideas. He noticed the scholars and the manuscripts but did not understand their significance, and could not grasp that intellectual achievement might be more valuable than material splendor. This blindness was willful. Europeans in the 19th century desperately needed to believe in African inferiority to justify colonialism. A city of scholars, of libraries, of sophisticated intellectual discourse, this contradicted the narrative of savagery and barbarism that made conquest seem like civilization. So the reality of Timbuktu was ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted. The manuscripts were acknowledged, but characterized as derivative, imitative, second-rate. The scholarly tradition was recognized but minimized, treated as a curious exception rather than evidence of African intellectual capacity. The local traditions, meanwhile, preserved a different understanding. Families who had maintained libraries for generations knew the value of what they possessed. They told stories of ancestor scholars, of men renowned for their learning, of times when Timbuktu attracted students from across the world. These traditions emphasized intellectual achievement, the pride of scholarship, the importance of preserving knowledge. They did not deny that trade brought wealth, that gold passed through the city, but they insisted that the real glory of Timbuktu was its learning. The contradiction between legend and reality, then, reveals more about those who created the legends than about Timbuktu itself. The European legend of gold reflected European values, the assumption that wealth meant material accumulation, that cities were measured by physical grandeur. The reality of Timbuktu reflected different values, the belief that knowledge was wealth, that learning brought honor, that a life spent in study and teaching was the highest calling. Both were real, both shaped the city's history, but they operated on different registers, valued different things, created different kinds of legacy. The gold is gone, traded away centuries ago, but the manuscripts remain, fragile and fading but still present, still speaking, still preserving the truth that Timbuktu's real wealth was never in its streets but in its libraries. The academic study of Timbuktu has been marked by passionate debates, by competing theories about the city's origins, its importance, the extent of its intellectual achievement, and its place in African and world history. These debates are not merely academic. They touch on fundamental questions about how we understand civilization, about who gets to participate in intellectual life, about whether Africa has contributed to human knowledge or merely received it from elsewhere. One central debate concerns origins. How did Timbuktu become a center of learning? Some scholars emphasize external factors, arguing that the city's intellectual life was essentially transplanted from North Africa and the Middle East, that Arab and Berber scholars brought Islamic learning to West Africa and established Timbuktu as an outpost of North African culture. According to this view, Timbuktu was significant but derivative, a provincial reflection of greater centers elsewhere. Others argue for a more indigenous development, emphasizing that while Islam certainly came from outside, the specific form it took in Timbuktu, the institutions that developed, the scholarly traditions that emerged, these were West African creations, shaped by local needs and local genius. They point to evidence of pre-Islamic learning in the region, of oral traditions that valued knowledge and memory, of social structures that honored teachers and supported students. In this view, Islam provided a framework and a script, but West Africans built the intellectual culture themselves. The truth, as often happens, probably lies between these extremes. Timbuktu's intellectual life was neither purely foreign nor purely indigenous, but a creative synthesis, taking Islamic texts and traditions and adapting them to West African contexts, producing something that was recognizably Islamic, but also distinctively Timbuktu, neither exactly like Cairo or Baghdad, nor entirely different. Another debate concerns scale and significance. Was Timbuktu truly one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world, comparable to the famous universities of the Islamic world and Europe, or has its importance been exaggerated by modern scholars eager to challenge Eurocentric narratives? The evidence is substantial but incomplete. We know that Timbuktu had tens of thousands of manuscripts, that it attracted scholars from across Africa and beyond, that its universities taught thousands of students. But we have fewer biographical details, fewer records of specific discoveries or innovations, less documentation of the kind that allows historians to reconstruct intellectual networks in detail. Some scholars argue that the mere existence of this scholarly community, the production and preservation of so many manuscripts, the continuity of learning over centuries, this is significant enough that Timbuktu need not have produced Aristotle's or Avicenna's to matter. Others maintain that without evidence of major original contributions, of ideas that changed fields or influenced distant scholars, Timbuktu was indeed provincial, important regionally but not globally, significant. This debate is complicated by loss. Many manuscripts have been destroyed over centuries, by warfare and neglect, by climate and insects, by deliberate suppression during colonial periods. We are working with a fraction of what once existed, and we cannot know what has been lost. Perhaps there were groundbreaking works that have disappeared. Perhaps Timbuktu's significance was even greater than current evidence suggests. Or perhaps what survives is representative, and Timbuktu's achievement was impressive but not revolutionary. There is also debate about the relationship between Timbuktu and other West African centers of learning. Was Timbuktu unique, or was it one of many cities where Islamic scholarship flourished? Recent research has revealed that places like Djenné, Gao, and other Sahel cities also had significant scholarly communities, that manuscripts were produced and preserved across the region, that Timbuktu was perhaps the most famous but not the only center. This complicates the narrative, suggesting that West African Islamic learning was more widespread than previously thought, but it also raises questions about what made Timbuktu special, why it became legendary while other cities remained obscure. Some scholars emphasize Timbuktu's commercial advantages, its position at the intersection of river and desert trade routes, arguing that economic prosperity enabled scholarly patronage. Others focus on specific individuals, on particularly charismatic or accomplished scholars who attracted students and raised the city's profile. Still, others point to political factors, to the patronage of Mali and Songhai rulers, who saw supporting learning as enhancing their legitimacy and connecting them to wider Islamic civilization. The role of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, is another area of debate. Timbuktu was strongly influenced by Sufi orders, particularly the Qadiriyya, which emphasized spiritual development alongside formal learning. Some scholars argue that this Sufi orientation made Timbuktu's Islam more flexible, more open to syncretism with local African traditions, more focused on personal piety than rigid orthodoxy. Others contend that Timbuktu scholars were quite orthodox, that the city was a center of Maliki legal thought, known for conservatism rather than innovation. There is ongoing debate about the role of women in Timbuktu's intellectual life. The manuscripts mention some women scholars, teachers of religious sciences, poets, and mystics. But the evidence is fragmentary and interpretations differ. Some scholars argue that women had more opportunities for education in Timbuktu than in many other Islamic societies, that the flexibility of informal education allowed talented women to study and teach. Others caution against overstating women's participation, noting that the vast majority of named scholars were men, that women's education was primarily domestic and religious rather than publicly scholarly. Perhaps the most contentious debate concerns Timbuktu's decline and whether it could have been prevented. Some argue that the city's fall was inevitable, that shifts in trade routes and the rise of Atlantic commerce doomed Saharan trading cities, that Timbuktu could not have adapted to changing economic realities. Others maintain that political factors were decisive, that the Moroccan conquest of 1591 destroyed Timbuktu's autonomy and scholarly independence, that with different leadership or different circumstances, the city might have maintained its position. These debates matter because they shape how we understand not just Timbuktu, but African history more broadly. If Timbuktu was derivative and provincial, it confirms narratives of African dependence on outside influences. If it was creative and significant, it challenges those narratives, demands a more complex and respectful account of African intellectual history. The debates continue, sometimes acrimonious, always complicated by incomplete evidence and by the weight of past prejudices. But they also demonstrate something important, that Timbuktu matters enough to argue about, that its history raises questions significant enough to warrant passionate scholarly attention, that even in debating its importance, we acknowledge that it was important, that it demands to be taken seriously. The modern investigation of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage is detective work on a grand scale, piecing together a lost world from fragmentary evidence, from manuscripts that survived against improbable odds, from archaeological remains half buried in sand, from oral traditions passed down through generations, from the careful analysis of every available source to reconstruct what was and what it meant. The work began in earnest in the 1920s and 30s when French colonial scholars, whatever their motives and limitations, started systematically searching for and cataloguing manuscripts. They worked with local families who had preserved books for generations, sometimes centuries, hidden in trunks and sealed rooms, protected from the elements and from thieves, passed down as precious heritage even when the languages in which they were written were no longer fully understood. What they found astonished them. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, covering shelves and filling rooms, written in beautiful Arabic calligraphy, some illuminated with gold, others plain but carefully copied, all testaments to a literate, scholarly culture that had thrived for centuries. The colonial scholars catalogued what they could, photographed some texts, removed others to archives in France and elsewhere, beginning a process of documentation that continues today. But the real acceleration came in the late 20th century, after Mali's independence, when African scholars took charge of their own heritage, when international cooperation became possible without colonial overtones, when new technologies made preservation and study easier. In the 1970s, UNESCO began supporting efforts to preserve Timbuktu's manuscripts. Researchers from Mali, Europe, America, and the Middle East collaborated on projects to catalogue, digitize, and analyze the texts. The Ahmed Baba Institute, named after one of Timbuktu's most famous scholars, was established as a major manuscript library and research centre. Family libraries were encouraged to deposit their manuscripts for professional conservation. Training programs taught local people how to preserve fragile documents, how to repair damaged pages, how to create climate-controlled storage that could protect books from Timbuktu's extreme heat and occasional humidity. The investigation revealed that the manuscripts covered an extraordinary range of subjects. The majority were religious, as expected in an Islamic scholarly community. Quranic commentaries explaining the meaning of verses, hadith collections, recording sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, works of jurisprudence examining Islamic law in minute detail, theological treatises debating the nature of God and the attributes of the divine, Sufi texts exploring mystical paths to spiritual knowledge. But there were also secular subjects. Astronomical manuscripts contained calculations of planetary movements, eclipse predictions, star charts used for navigation and timekeeping. Mathematical works included geometry and algebra, practical arithmetic for commerce, numerology that blended mathematics with mysticism. Medical manuscripts described diseases and their treatments, listed medicinal plants and their properties, explained surgical procedures and anatomical knowledge. Historical chronicles recorded the rise and fall of kingdoms, the deeds of rulers, the succession of dynasties. Biographical dictionaries listed scholars, their teachers and students, their major works and contributions. There were manuscripts on grammar and rhetoric, on logic and philosophy, on geography and ethnography, and there was literature, poetry celebrating love and devotion, satirical verses mocking rivals and enemies, epic narratives of heroes and battles, refined prose exploring moral and aesthetic themes. The investigation also employed archaeology. Excavations in Timbuktu revealed the foundations of buildings, the layout of neighborhoods, evidence of workshops where manuscripts were copied and bound. They found remains of the paper-making industry that supplied local scribes, discovered ink pots and reed pens, uncovered the physical infrastructure that supported intellectual production. Oral history projects complemented the manuscript and archaeological work. Researchers interviewed descendants of scholarly families, recorded traditions about ancestor scholars, collected stories about famous teachers and their students. These oral sources provided context that manuscripts alone could not, revealed the human dimension of Timbuktu's scholarly community, preserved memories of how the intellectual life actually functioned. Chemical analysis of manuscripts provided unexpected insights. By analyzing ink composition, researchers could sometimes determine when and where a manuscript was written, could identify forgeries or later editions, could trace connections between different texts. Paper analysis revealed trade networks, showing that Timbuktu imported paper from Italy and the Middle East, that local paper-making developed in response to demand, that the city was plugged into global networks of manuscript production. Comparative studies placed Timbuktu in wider context. Scholars compared Timbuktu manuscripts with texts from Cairo, Fez, Damascus, Baghdad, tracing intellectual networks, identifying which texts were widely studied, which ideas circulated across the Islamic world, where Timbuktu scholars made original contributions. This work revealed that Timbuktu was not isolated, but fully integrated into Islamic intellectual life, that its scholars read the same texts as scholars elsewhere, participated in the same debates, contributed to the same scholarly conversations. Digital humanities brought new tools to the investigation. High-resolution scanning allowed damaged or faded manuscripts to be read using advanced imaging techniques. Text recognition software helped catalogue and search vast numbers of documents. Network analysis mapped relationships between scholars, creating visualizations of intellectual communities. Databases made manuscripts accessible to researchers worldwide, democratizing access to Timbuktu's heritage. But the investigation has also confronted obstacles. Many manuscripts remain in private hands, inaccessible to researchers, sometimes because families do not trust outsiders, sometimes because owners hope to profit from their heritage, sometimes simply because the manuscripts have not been rediscovered. Conservation is expensive and ongoing, requiring resources that Mali, one of the world's poorest countries, struggles to provide. Political instability and conflict have threatened the manuscripts repeatedly, most dramatically in 2012 and 2013, when Islamist extremists occupied Timbuktu and burned some libraries. Though local heroes managed to smuggle many manuscripts to safety, the investigation of Timbuktu is far from complete. New manuscripts surface regularly. Texts, thought lost, are rediscovered. Each finding adds detail, raises new questions, complicates previous understandings. But enough has been learned to say with certainty that Timbuktu was home to a sophisticated, productive intellectual community, that its scholars were serious and accomplished, that its libraries preserved knowledge of immense value, that its place in African and world history is secure. The investigation continues, patient and methodical, piecing together truth from fragments, recovering a heritage that was nearly lost, ensuring that Timbuktu's scholars, silent for centuries, can finally speak again. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are not abstractions, not merely symbols of intellectual achievement. They are physical objects, made of paper and ink, bound in leather, marked by the hands that created them and the conditions that preserved them. They smell of age and dust, their pages brittle and fragile, their calligraphy faded but still legible, still speaking across centuries to anyone willing to listen. Hold one of these manuscripts. if you are fortunate enough to be granted access, and you are holding a direct connection to the past. The paper, often Italian or Middle Eastern, imported across the Sahara at great expense, sometimes shows watermarks that can be dated, that reveal trade connections. The ink, usually black made from soot or iron gall, occasionally red for emphasis or headings, has a particular texture and smell, evidence of chemical composition that specialists can analyze. The binding, leather over, wooden boards, sometimes decorated with tooled patterns, sometimes plain, shows how the manuscript was valued and used. The calligraphy reveals individual scribes, their training and skill, their personality expressed in the way they formed letters, in their spacing and proportion, in the care or haste with which they worked. Some manuscripts are masterpieces, every page a work of art, the text surrounded by geometric or floral designs, key passages highlighted in gold leaf. These were commissioned by wealthy patrons, created by master calligraphers, intended to demonstrate status and piety. Others are utilitarian, copied quickly by students or working scribes, the handwriting variable, corrections and marginal notes visible, evidence of practical use rather than aesthetic display. One category of manuscripts particularly reveals Timbuktu's scholarly culture, the ijazas, or certificates of transmission. These documents recorded that a student had studied a particular text with a particular teacher, that the teacher had verified the student's mastery of the material, that the student was now authorized to teach that text to others. The ijazas created chains of transmission connecting contemporary scholars to the Prophet Muhammad through unbroken lines of teachers and students, stretching back centuries. A scholar in Timbuktu could trace his authority to teach a specific hadith collection through 20 or 30 or 40 generations of scholars, each one having learned from the previous, creating a lineage of knowledge that was precious and carefully guarded. These certificates also reveal the geographic scope of Timbuktu's scholarly networks. A Timbuktu scholar might have ijazas from teachers in Fez and Cairo, in Mecca and Medina, proof of travels undertaken to study with famous scholars, of pilgrimages that combined religious devotion with intellectual advancement. Conversely, scholars from North Africa and the Middle East sometimes came to Timbuktu, drawn by its reputation, and their presence is recorded in ijazas they granted to local students. The astronomical manuscripts provide particularly concrete evidence of Timbuktu's scholarly sophistication. These texts include tables for calculating planetary positions, methods for determining prayer times based on the sun's position, guides for using stars to navigate the desert. Some are copies of famous works by Islamic astronomers like al-Battani or al-Zarqali. Others show original calculations, observations made from Timbuktu's latitude, adaptations of standard tables for local use. The precision of these calculations, the complexity of the mathematics involved, leaves no doubt that Timbuktu scholars were competent mathematicians and astronomers, capable of serious scientific work. Medical manuscripts reveal knowledge of human anatomy, of disease pathology, of pharmaceutical preparations. They list hundreds of medicinal plants, many local to West Africa, with instructions for preparing and administering remedies. They describe surgical procedures, diagnostic techniques, and preventive measures. Some draw on classical Islamic medical texts by authors like Ibn Sina and al-Razi. Others incorporate local African medical knowledge, creating a hybrid tradition that blended Islamic and indigenous healing practices. Historical chronicles are among the most valuable manuscripts for reconstructing Timbuktu's past. The Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash, written in the 17th century, provide detailed accounts of the Songhai Empire and earlier West African kingdoms. They record battles and political intrigues, describe the reigns of various rulers, list scholars and their accomplishments, preserve information that exists nowhere else. These chronicles are not objective or complete. They were written from particular perspectives, with particular biases, but they are invaluable sources, often the only written records of events and people who would otherwise be lost to history. Legal manuscripts, collections of fatwas or legal opinions on specific questions, reveal the concerns of Timbuktu's Muslim community. What happens if a slave converts to Islam? How should inheritance be divided in complex family situations? What are the rules for commercial transactions, for marriage and divorce, for criminal punishment? These legal texts show Islamic law being applied to West African contexts, adapted to local customs and conditions, creating a distinctively Timbuktu version of Maliki jurisprudence. Poetry manuscripts preserve emotional and aesthetic dimensions, often missing from more formal texts. Love poetry, sometimes explicit, sometimes refined and elusive, shows that Timbuktu scholars were not just dry academics but people who experienced passion and beauty, who valued artistry and expression. Satirical poetry reveals feuds and rivalries, moments when scholarly debates became personal, when insults were exchanged in verse. Devotional poetry expresses mystical longing, the desire for union with the divine, the ecstasy and agony of Sufi spirituality. The margins of manuscripts often contain marginalia, notes added by readers and students over centuries. These might be explanations of difficult passages, cross-references to related texts, arguments with the author's positions, personal reflections, and prayers. The marginalia create layers of meaning, show how texts were read and interpreted over time, reveal the active engagement of readers who were not passive recipients but active participants in intellectual discourse. Perhaps most poignant are the ownership marks and family seals that appear on manuscripts, evidence of the families who preserved these texts for generations, who saw them as precious heritage, even during times when Timbuktu's scholarly culture had declined, when the books might have seemed valueless to outsiders. These families, often themselves descended from scholars, maintained libraries through warfare and poverty, through colonialism and neglect, driven by a conviction that the manuscripts mattered, that preserving them was a sacred trust, that someday the world would recognize their value. The evidence, then, is tangible and substantial. Not theories or speculation, but physical objects that can be studied and analysed, that reveal through their content and their form what Timbuktu was, what its scholars achieved, what its intellectual life meant. The manuscripts are fragments of a lost world, but they are enough, more than enough, to prove that the world existed, that it was sophisticated and valuable, that it deserves to be remembered and honoured. The deeper mystery of Timbuktu is not about whether it was a centre of learning or how significant its scholars were. Those questions have been answered. The manuscripts exist, the evidence is clear, the achievement is established. The deeper mystery is about networks, about connections that stretched across continents, about how a city in the middle of the Sahara became a node in global systems of trade and knowledge, about what this reveals about medieval globalization and about the lies later told to deny it. What they never told us is that Timbuktu was not isolated, was never the remote outpost of legend. It was connected, deeply integrated into networks that linked West Africa to North Africa, to the Middle East, to the Mediterranean world, to the Indian Ocean trading system, creating a version of globalization that predated European colonial expansion by centuries. These connections were not incidental or superficial. They were fundamental to Timbuktu's existence, to its prosperity, to its intellectual life. The trade networks are easiest to trace. Gold from West African kingdoms, mined in places like Bambouk and Bure, was carried to Timbuktu, then north across the Sahara to trading cities like Sijil Massa in Morocco. From there it entered Mediterranean trade, was minted into coins in Venice and Genoa, circulated across Europe and the Islamic world. The gold that financed Renaissance Italy, that appeared in European cathedrals and palaces, that backed currencies and funded armies, much of it came from West Africa, transported through Timbuktu. In exchange came salt from Saharan mines like Tagaza, where workers laboured in brutal conditions to extract slabs of salt that were worth their weight in gold in the south. But also cloth from North Africa and Europe, books and paper, horses and weapons, luxury goods of all kinds. Timbuktu was a clearinghouse, a place where goods from vastly different regions met and were exchanged, where merchants from different cultures negotiated deals, where languages and customs mixed. But the intellectual networks were equally important and far less recognized. Scholars traveled between Timbuktu and the great centers of Islamic learning, Cairo and Tunis, Fez and Marrakesh, Mecca and Medina. They carried manuscripts, shared ideas, studied with famous teachers, then returned home to teach what they had learned. This created an intellectual diaspora, a community of scholars spread across vast distances, but united by shared texts, shared methods, shared participation in ongoing scholarly debates. A Timbuktu scholar might travel to Cairo to study at Al-Azhar University, spend years mastering texts with Egyptian teachers, acquire ijazas, authorizing him to teach those texts, then return to Timbuktu, bringing new knowledge, new books, new perspectives. His students would benefit from this transmitted knowledge, would study texts that were being studied simultaneously in Cairo and Damascus and Isfahan, would participate, perhaps indirectly but genuinely, in intellectual conversations happening across the Islamic world. The networks also moved in the opposite direction. Scholars from North Africa and the Middle East sometimes came to Timbuktu, drawn by its reputation, by opportunities to teach and study, by wealthy patrons offering support. They brought their own expertise, their own libraries, enriching Timbuktu's intellectual culture, creating a cosmopolitan scholarly community that was African but not exclusively so, that was part of the wider Islamic world, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. What they never told us is that this networking was normal, that medieval Islamic civilization was genuinely international, that scholars routinely travelled vast distances, that knowledge circulated across continents, that geographical distance was not the barrier it would later become. Timbuktu's participation in these networks was not exceptional. Many cities across the Islamic world were similarly connected, similarly engaged in exchanging scholars and ideas. What was exceptional was that Timbuktu did this while being located in sub-Saharan Africa, while being predominantly Black African, while being so far from the traditional centres of Islamic civilization. This challenges the narrative of African isolation, the idea that Africa was cut off from the rest of the world before European contact, that Africans were not participants in global history. Timbuktu proves this narrative is false, that West Africa was integrated into medieval globalization, that African scholars were reading the same texts and debating the same ideas as scholars in Cairo and Baghdad, that intellectual life crossed racial and continental boundaries more easily in the 15th century than it would in the 19th. The deeper mystery also involves what was exchanged. It was not just a one-way transmission of knowledge from the Middle East to Africa. Timbuktu scholars made contributions, wrote original works that circulated beyond West Africa, influenced scholars in other regions. The evidence for this is fragmentary, because so many manuscripts have been lost, because records from other regions rarely credited African scholars, because later prejudice denied the possibility of African originality. But enough survives to prove it happened. Timbuktu scholars wrote commentaries on standard Islamic texts that were copied and studied elsewhere. They composed original works on West African history and geography that were consulted by scholars in North Africa. They developed legal opinions adapted to West African contexts that influenced Islamic jurisprudence more broadly. They made astronomical observations from Timbuktu's latitude that contributed to understanding celestial movements. The exchange was mutual, the networks multidirectional, the intellectual traffic moving both ways. What they never told us is that this global system of Islamic scholarship, this network that connected Timbuktu to Cairo to Baghdad to Samarkand, was disrupted and eventually destroyed not by internal failure, but by European colonialism. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which had functioned for centuries, were undermined by Atlantic trade controlled by European powers. The scholarly networks, which had allowed free movement of ideas and people, were fragmented by colonial borders and restrictions. The cosmopolitan Islamic world, which had valued learning regardless of race or geography, was replaced by a racialized order that denied African intellectual capacity. Timbuktu's decline, which began in the late 16th century with the Moroccan invasion and accelerated under French colonialism, was not proof of African inferiority or Islamic stagnation. It was the result of violent disruption of functioning systems, of the imposition of new economic and political orders that marginalized places and people that had previously thrived. The mystery is not why Timbuktu declined, but how it survived at all, how manuscripts were preserved through centuries of chaos, how families maintained libraries and traditions, how enough evidence survived to allow reconstruction of this lost world of connection and exchange. The deeper mystery, then, is about what colonialism hid, what narratives it suppressed, what truths it denied. Timbuktu was part of a globalized medieval world, a world where knowledge and goods and people moved across continents, where Africa was not isolated but integrated, not passive but active, not receiving civilization but creating it. This truth was inconvenient for colonizers, who needed to believe, and needed others to believe, that they were bringing progress to a backward continent. So it was hidden, denied, erased, replaced with myths of isolation and primitiveness. Recovering this truth, understanding these networks, seeing Timbuktu in its proper context, this is the deeper investigation, the one that reveals not just what Timbuktu was, but what the world was before empire rewrote history. In the year 1324, an emperor named Mansa Musa left his capital in the Mali Empire and began a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey of thousands of miles across the Sahara and through Egypt, undertaken to fulfill the religious obligation of every Muslim who is able. This pilgrimage, the Hajj, was not unusual. Thousands of Muslims made it every year. But Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was different, so extravagant, so lavish, so impossible to ignore that it changed how the world saw West Africa, and in doing so, it changed Timbuktu's destiny forever. The chroniclers describe an entourage of 60,000 people, including soldiers and officials, servants and slaves, wives and concubines, scholars and holy men. They describe 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold, personal servants carrying staffs of gold, even horses with golden bridles. The numbers might be exaggerated. Chroniclers often inflated figures to emphasize importance, but even if we discount them significantly, this was an enormous expedition, a moving city crossing the desert, a demonstration of wealth and power on a scale rarely seen. When Mansa Musa reached Cairo, then the greatest city in the Islamic world, he distributed gold so freely that he destabilized the Egyptian economy. He gave to beggars and scholars, to officials and merchants, to anyone who approached him. He purchased supplies and gifts, commissioned buildings and charities, spent with such abandon that the price of gold in Egypt fell and did not recover for more than a decade. The Egyptian chroniclers, accustomed to wealthy pilgrims, were stunned. They had never seen anything like this, never imagined that an African king could command such resources. The pilgrimage was a turning point, not because it changed Mali or Timbuktu internally. The empire was already wealthy and powerful, the city already a trading centre, but because it changed external perceptions. Suddenly, West Africa was on the map, literally. European and Arab cartographers began marking Mali and Timbuktu on their maps, depicting Mansa Musa seated on a throne, holding a golden orb, labelled as the richest king in the world. Merchants began to pay more attention to trans-Saharan trade, seeing opportunities for profit. Scholars began to wonder about this wealthy kingdom, about its cities and its culture. For Timbuktu specifically, the pilgrimage was transformative. Mansa Musa, having seen the great mosques and universities of Cairo and Mecca, having met scholars from across the Islamic world, having witnessed the prestige that learning brought, was determined to bring this to his own empire. On his return journey, he brought back with him architects and scholars, poets and theologians, men who could build mosques in the grand style and who could establish schools to teach Islamic sciences. According to tradition, one of these scholars was Abu Ishaq es-Saheli, an Andalusian poet and architect who designed mosques in Timbuktu in a new style incorporating elements from North African and Middle Eastern architecture, using burnt brick and geometric designs that made the buildings more impressive, more permanent, more suitable as centres of learning. Whether Es-Sahili actually existed or was a legendary figure is debated, but what is certain is that after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, mosque construction in Timbuktu became more ambitious, more sophisticated, more focused on creating spaces for education as well as worship. The emperor also endowed these mosques lavishly, providing funds for their maintenance, for salaries for teachers, for scholarships for students. He made learning a priority, something supported by the state, something that brought honour to those who pursued it. This patronage was crucial. Scholars could now dedicate themselves to study and teaching without worrying about survival, could build libraries, could attract students, could create the critical mass necessary for a true intellectual community. The pilgrimage also established Mali, and by extension Timbuktu, as legitimately part of the Islamic world. Before Mansa Musa, West African Islam might have seemed peripheral, suspect, possibly tainted by syncretism with local religions. After his spectacular Hajj, after his generosity in Mecca and Cairo, after his visible piety and his support for Islamic learning, no one could question that Mali was genuinely Muslim, that its rulers were committed to Islam, that its scholars were part of the broader Islamic intellectual community. This legitimacy mattered. It meant that scholars from elsewhere in the Islamic world would consider coming to Timbuktu, would recognize study there as valid, would accept ijazas granted by Timbuktu scholars. It meant that Timbuktu students traveling to study in Cairo or Tunis would be welcomed, would be seen as fellow Muslims rather than exotic foreigners. It integrated Timbuktu into networks that might otherwise have excluded or marginalized it. The turning point was also economic. The attention drawn by Mansa Musa's pilgrimage increased trade. More merchants wanted to access West African gold, more caravans crossed the Sahara, more goods flowed through Timbuktu. This increased wealth circulated back into the city, funded more construction, supported more scholars, allowed the intellectual life to flourish alongside the commercial life. But there was a cost, an unintended consequence that would not become apparent for centuries. By revealing West Africa's wealth so dramatically, by distributing gold so freely, Mansa Musa made the region a target. He demonstrated that enormous wealth existed south of the Sahara, wealth that could potentially be claimed by whoever was strong enough to take it. This would eventually draw unwanted attention from Moroccan sultans seeking to control gold sources, from European powers who heard tales of golden kingdoms and wanted their share. In 1324, these future troubles were invisible. What was visible was a successful pilgrimage, a triumphant return, a kingdom, and a city ascending to new prominence. Timbuktu, before Mansa Musa, was a successful trading town with a growing scholarly community. Timbuktu, after Mansa Musa, was an international centre known across the Islamic world and beyond, associated with wealth and learning, attracting scholars and students, merchants and travellers, all drawn by the reputation the emperor's pilgrimage had created. The turning point was not a single decision or event, but a threshold crossed, a moment when Timbuktu's trajectory changed, when it moved from being regionally important to being internationally significant, when it became not just a city in West Africa, but a centre that mattered to the wider world. Everything that came after, the golden age of the 15th and 16th centuries, the great libraries and famous scholars, the cosmopolitan intellectual culture, all of this was made possible by what Mansa Musa began, by the reputation he created, by the resources and attention his pilgrimage brought to his empire and its cities. The turning point was a door opening, and Timbuktu, ready and ambitious, walked through. The century following Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was Timbuktu's golden age, a time when the consequences of that turning point unfolded, when the seeds planted by imperial patronage blossomed into a full-fledged intellectual culture, when the city became what it had aspired to be, a true centre of Islamic learning. a university city where knowledge was pursued with passion and rigor, where scholarship was honored above wealth, where books were the most precious possessions. The Mali Empire provided stability, security, patronage. Under successive emperors, trade flourished, caravans moved safely across the Sahara, merchants accumulated wealth, and some of that wealth flowed to scholars, to mosques, to libraries. The city grew, not dramatically in population but in reputation, in the quality of its teachers, in the depth of its collections, in the sophistication of its intellectual discourse. Students came from across West Africa, from the kingdoms of the south, from Songhai and Hausa lands, from smaller states that orbited the great empires, all seeking education that would bring them prestige and opportunity. But empires rise and fall. By the mid-15th century, Mali was weakening, its control over distant provinces loosening, its authority challenged by ambitious subordinates and external enemies. The Songhai people, who had long chafed under Mali rule, began asserting independence. Under their leader, Soni Ali, who took power in 1464, they built their own empire, conquering territory, challenging Mali's supremacy, and eventually, in 1468, capturing Timbuktu itself. Soni Ali was a warrior, ruthless and effective, feared by his enemies and by many of his own people. He was nominally Muslim but also practiced traditional African religions, consulted with priests and sorcerers, engaged in syncretism that troubled Orthodox Muslims. When he took Timbuktu, the city's scholars, accustomed to rulers who honored learning and supported scholarship, found themselves under a king who was suspicious of their influence, who resented their criticism of his religious practices, who saw them as potential threats to his authority. The consequences were severe. Soni Ali persecuted Timbuktu scholars, executed some, exiled others, confiscated property, disrupted the intellectual life that had flourished for a century. The great scholar, Muhammad al-Kabir, head of the Sankore Mosque University, was killed. Others fled to Walata or other cities where they would be safer. Libraries were scattered. The networks that had made Timbuktu a centre of learning were damaged, perhaps irreparably. But then Soni Ali died in 1492, drowned crossing a river, or possibly assassinated. The sources are unclear. His son tried to succeed him but was overthrown by one of Soni Ali's generals, a man named Mohammed Toure, who took the title Askia and who would prove to be Timbuktu's greatest patron, the ruler who brought the city to its absolute peak. Askia Muhammad, ruling from 1493 to 1528, was everything Soni Ali was not. Deeply pious, orthodox in his Islam, respectful of scholarship, committed to supporting learning as a religious duty and as a tool of statecraft. He made his own pilgrimage to Mecca, modelling himself on Mansa Musa, distributing wealth, meeting scholars, establishing his credentials as a legitimate Muslim ruler. When he returned, he set about reversing the damage Soni Ali had done. He invited scholars back to Timbuktu, offered them positions and patronage, rebuilt mosques and schools, donated to libraries, created an environment where intellectual work could resume and flourish. He appointed scholars to high positions in his government, used them as advisors and judges, integrated them into the structure of power in ways that gave them influence and protection. Under Askia Muhammad, Timbuktu reached heights it had never achieved before. The University of Sankore, which had been damaged under Soni Ali, was restored and expanded. At its peak, it had 25,000 students. Though this figure likely includes elementary students at attached Quranic schools, not just advanced scholars. But even accounting for inflation, this was a substantial scholarly community, one of the largest in the Islamic world. The university had no formal structure, no degrees or graduation ceremonies, but it functioned as a true centre of higher learning, where advanced texts were studied, where scholarly debates occurred, where knowledge was created and transmitted. Scholars from this period became famous across the Islamic world. Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti, born in 1556, became one of the most renowned scholars of his generation. author of more than 40 books on jurisprudence, biography, grammar, and theology. His works were studied not just in Timbuktu but in Fez and Cairo, were cited by scholars from Morocco to Egypt. He represented Timbuktu at its intellectual peak, proof that African scholars could contribute to Islamic learning at the highest levels. But the peak was also the beginning of decline. The Songhai Empire, like Mali before it, grew too large, became difficult to govern, faced challenges from multiple directions. To the west, the Kingdom of Morocco, unified and ambitious, looked south toward the gold trade, toward the wealth of the Sahel, seeing opportunity in Songhai's growing weakness. And in 1591, the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sent an army across the Sahara, armed with firearms that the Songhai forces lacked, to conquer the great cities of the Niger River and claim their wealth for Morocco. The Moroccan army, led by a Spanish eunuch named Judah Pasha, defeated the Songhai forces at the Battle of Tondibi, then marched on Timbuktu. The city surrendered without a fight, its scholars hoping that submission would spare them, that the Moroccans would respect learning as previous conquerors had. They were wrong. The Moroccans came for gold and slaves, for immediate profit, not for the long-term benefits of stable rule. They plundered the city, confiscated wealth, disrupted trade, broke the networks that had sustained Timbuktu's prosperity. Worse, they targeted the scholars, seeing them as potential leaders of resistance, as dangerous because of their influence and prestige. Ahmad Baba and other prominent scholars were arrested and sent in chains across the Sahara to Marrakesh, where they were imprisoned. Ahmad Baba spent 2 years in jail, then lived in exile in Morocco for 14 years before being allowed to return home. Many scholars never returned, died in exile, or chose to stay in Morocco, where they continued teaching and writing, but were separated from the libraries and students that had made Timbuktu special. The consequence of the Moroccan conquest was catastrophic. Timbuktu never recovered its position as an intellectual centre. Trade declined as the trans-Saharan routes became less safe, as the Moroccans proved unable to maintain the order that had previously existed. The Moroccan garrison in Timbuktu gradually became isolated, cut off from Morocco, eventually mixing with the local population and forming a distinct ruling class called the Ama, but they lacked the resources or interest to support scholarship as previous rulers had. The libraries survived, at least partially, protected by families who hid manuscripts, who understood that even if the city was declining, the books were precious, were heritage that must be preserved. But the intellectual community dispersed, scholars moved to other cities, or gave up scholarship for more practical pursuits. Students stopped coming. The mosques where teaching had occurred fell into disrepair, or were used for prayer alone, without the educational functions they had previously served. The rise had been spectacular, a century and a half of intellectual flowering, of scholarship that rivaled the great centres of the Islamic world, of a city where learning mattered most. The fall was equally dramatic, a sudden collapse triggered by external conquest, but rooted in the fragility of systems that depended on patronage, on trade, on political stability. The consequence was loss, not total but substantial, not immediate but accelerating, the slow fading of a city that had been bright, the silence falling over libraries that had been alive with debate and discussion. Timbuktu would survive, would remain inhabited, would maintain some scholarly traditions, but the golden age was over, ended by violence and ambition, by the consequences of being too wealthy, too famous, too tempting a target for those who valued gold more than knowledge. The impact of Timbuktu extends far beyond the mud brick walls of a single city, far beyond the manuscripts hidden in family libraries, far beyond even the impressive but finite achievements of its scholars. Timbuktu shaped our world in ways both direct and subtle, in influences that can be traced and in absences that reveal what we lost when the city declined, in what it proved about human potential and in what colonialism tried to deny. The most immediate impact was regional, on West African Islam, which was permanently shaped by the scholarly traditions developed in Timbuktu. The Maliki school of Islamic law, which became dominant across West Africa, was studied and refined in Timbuktu's universities. The interpretations developed there, the fatwas issued by Timbuktu scholars, the legal texts they wrote, all of this influenced how Islam was practiced across the Sahel and into the forests of the south. When Islam spread to new regions, it often came through scholars trained in Timbuktu or influenced by Timbuktu traditions. The impact was also literary and cultural. The chronicles written in Timbuktu, particularly the Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, preserved West African history that would otherwise have been lost. These texts recorded the rise and fall of empires, the deeds of rulers, the accomplishments of scholars, the social and cultural life of the region. They are among the earliest written sources for West African history, invaluable for modern historians trying to reconstruct the past. Without them, vast stretches of West African history would remain obscure, known only through oral traditions or archaeological evidence. Timbuktu's scholars also influenced Islamic thought more broadly, though this impact is harder to trace, because records from other regions often did not credit African scholars, because later prejudice assumed that influence flowed only one direction, from the Islamic heartland to the periphery. But evidence exists. Manuscripts from Timbuktu circulated in North Africa were copied and studied in Fez and Tunis. Works by Timbuktu scholars were cited by Moroccan and Egyptian scholars, were included in anthologies and bibliographies. The intellectual traffic was not one way, and Timbuktu contributed to ongoing scholarly conversations in ways that shaped Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and literature. The city also played a crucial role in preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. During periods when books were burned elsewhere, when religious or political authorities suppressed dangerous ideas, Timbuktu's remote location and its culture of book collecting provided a refuge. Some Greek philosophical texts, preserved in Arabic translation, survived in Timbuktu when they were lost or suppressed elsewhere. Medical and scientific works, historical texts, poetry that was considered heretical or subversive, all found their way to Timbuktu's libraries and were preserved there. This role as preserver is part of Timbuktu's global impact. The manuscripts that survived, that are now being digitized and made available to researchers worldwide, contain knowledge that contributes to our understanding not just of West Africa, but of the medieval Islamic world more broadly, of intellectual history, of the transmission of classical knowledge, of the development of scientific and philosophical ideas across cultures and centuries. But perhaps Timbuktu's greatest impact is symbolic, is what the city represents in contemporary struggles over history and identity. For Africans, Timbuktu is proof that the continent has intellectual traditions, that Africa contributed to world civilization, that the narrative of African inferiority and dependence on outside influence is false. When a young African student learns about Timbuktu, when they see images of ancient manuscripts written in beautiful Arabic calligraphy, when they discover that their ancestors built universities and wrote books, it changes how they see themselves, how they understand their place in history, how they imagine their future possibilities. For the world beyond Africa, Timbuktu challenges comfortable narratives about the march of civilization, about who creates knowledge and who merely receives it. It forces recognition that medieval Africa was not isolated or primitive but sophisticated and connected, that black scholars were reading Aristotle and Plato, while much of Europe had forgotten they existed, that universities flourished in the Sahel, while much of medieval Europe was largely illiterate. This is uncomfortable knowledge for those invested in narratives of European exceptionalism, and so it has been resisted, downplayed, questioned, but it cannot be denied. The impact is also cautionary. Timbuktu's decline, the dispersal of its scholarly community, the near loss of its manuscripts, all serve as warnings about the fragility of intellectual culture, about how easily knowledge can be lost, how political instability and violence can destroy in years what took centuries to build. The manuscripts that survived did so through luck and through the dedication of families who preserved them, despite having no institutional support, despite poverty and warfare, despite the fact that the wider world had forgotten or never knew their value. In recent years, Timbuktu's impact has become more immediate and more urgent. When Islamist extremists occupied the city in 2012 and 2013, when they burned manuscripts they considered heretical or un-Islamic, the world paid attention. The story of local librarians who smuggled manuscripts to safety, who risked their lives to preserve their heritage, became international news. It reminded people that cultural heritage is always at risk, that knowledge must be actively protected, that what seems permanent can be destroyed quickly if not defended. The manuscripts that were saved are now being digitized, made available online, studied by researchers from around the world. This democratization of access means that Timbuktu's intellectual heritage is no longer locked in a remote city, accessible only to those who can travel there. It is becoming truly global, part of the shared heritage of humanity, available to anyone with internet access. This fulfills, in a way, the cosmopolitan vision of Timbuktu scholars, who saw themselves as participants in a global intellectual community, who valued knowledge above all else, who would be pleased to know that their work is finally reaching the world. The impact of Timbuktu, then, is ongoing, still unfolding, still revealing itself as more manuscripts are studied, as more connections are traced, as more people learn the truth about what this city was and what it means. It shapes our understanding of African history, of Islamic intellectual traditions, of medieval globalization, of the relationship between knowledge and power. It challenges us to see the world more completely, to acknowledge achievements we have ignored, to recognize that civilization has always been a human endeavor, emerging wherever people had resources and opportunity, never the exclusive property of any race or region. That is Timbuktu's legacy, and it reverberates still. Behind every manuscript copied in Timbuktu, beneath every scholarly debate, within every transaction in the markets, and every lesson taught in mosque courtyards, there were people whose names have mostly been forgotten, whose lives are recorded only in fragments, who created and sustained the city through their labor and their choices, who were as fully human as anyone living today, with hopes and fears and dreams that mattered to them, even if history has largely overlooked them. There were the scribes who copied manuscripts, men and sometimes women who spent their days bent over paper, carefully forming Arabic letters, reproducing texts that might be studied for generations. Their work was painstaking, requiring intense concentration, precision, knowledge of the texts they were copying sufficient to catch and correct errors. They mixed their own inks from soot or iron gall, prepared their reed pens, calculated how much text would fit on a page, maintained the consistency of their handwriting across hundreds of pages. This was skilled labour, respected and reasonably compensated, but it was also exhausting work that strained eyes and cramped hands. Some scribes were scholars themselves, copying texts as part of their education, mastering material by reproducing it. Others were professional copyists who might not fully understand the complex theological or mathematical texts they transcribed, but who were expert at accurate reproduction. They took pride in their work, in the beauty of their calligraphy, in the durability of their craftsmanship. A well-copied manuscript, carefully bound, properly preserved, could last for centuries, and the scribes knew that their work was creating something permanent, something that would outlive them and carry knowledge forward. There were the students who came to Timbuktu seeking education, young men, mostly, though some women studied as well, who left their homes and families to sit at the feet of famous scholars, to memorize texts, to engage in debates, to earn ijazas that would certify their mastery and allow them to teach. These students lived simply, often in poverty, supported by small stipends from mosque endowments, or by working part-time as copyists or tutors to younger students. They formed communities, study groups that supported each other intellectually and emotionally, friendships forged through shared struggle and shared passion for learning. Not all students succeeded. Some found the material too difficult, the memorization too demanding, the life too austere. They dropped out, returned home, pursued other paths. But those who persevered, who spent years mastering texts, who earned their ijazas and became scholars themselves. They carried Timbuktu with them wherever they went, spread its scholarly traditions, maintained networks that connected Timbuktu to other centres of learning across West Africa and beyond. There were the merchants who funded much of Timbuktu's scholarly life, whose wealth from trade allowed them to patronise scholars, to donate to mosques, to commission manuscripts, to support students. These were practical men, concerned with profit and loss, with the timing of caravans and the fluctuation of prices, with managing complex commercial operations that extended across the Sahara. But they were also often pious, believing that supporting learning was a religious duty, that charity earned spiritual merit, that education benefited society in ways that justified its cost. Some merchants became scholars themselves in later life, retiring from commerce to study and teach, using the wealth they had accumulated to support their own intellectual pursuits. Others remained businessmen but maintained close relationships with scholars, invited them to their homes, engaged them in conversations about law and theology, sought their advice on ethical questions related to commerce. The boundary between merchant and scholar was permeable, and many families produced both, creating social networks that tied economic and intellectual life together. There were the women, largely invisible in the historical record but certainly present, whose roles varied depending on their status and circumstances. Elite women, wives, and daughters of scholars and merchants sometimes received extensive education, studied with female teachers, or occasionally with male scholars who were relatives. Some became teachers themselves, particularly of religious sciences to other women and girls. A few are mentioned in biographical dictionaries, praised for their learning and piety. But for every one named, there were likely dozens whose education went unrecorded. Common women, wives of craftsmen and labourers, received less formal education but were not entirely excluded from literacy and learning. Many could recite Quranic verses, new prayers, and religious obligations, participated in ceremonies and festivals. They managed households, raised children, worked in markets as traders and food preparers, maintained social networks that were as important to the city's functioning as the more visible, male-dominated institutions. Their labour made everything else possible, but because it was domestic and seemingly ordinary, it was rarely recorded, rarely considered worthy of historical attention. There were the children who grew up in Timbuktu, who played in the sandy streets, who attended Quranic school, where they learned to recite verses and write Arabic letters, who absorbed the city's culture of valuing learning, of respecting scholars, of taking pride in books and education. Some of these children would become the next generation of scholars, but most would pursue other paths, become merchants or craftsmen, farmers or herders, but all would carry with them the values of their upbringing, the belief that knowledge mattered, that books were precious, that learning was honourable. And there were the enslaved, whose presence in Timbuktu, as in most pre-modern cities, is undeniable but difficult to document in detail. Some slaves were domestic servants, others worked in trade, as porters or caravan attendants. Slavery in Islamic West Africa was different from the chattel slavery that would later develop in the Americas. Slaves had some legal rights, could own property, could sometimes buy their freedom, but it was still slavery, still a condition of subordination and limited freedom that no one would choose voluntarily. Some enslaved people achieved education, were taught by their owners, in some cases became scholars themselves while technically still enslaved. Islamic law encouraged the education and eventual manumission of slaves, and some Timbuktu scholars freed enslaved people as acts of piety, as fulfillment of religious obligations. But this was not universal, and many remained enslaved their entire lives, their labour sustaining the households and institutions that are celebrated in history while they themselves remain nameless. All of these people, scribes and students, merchants and women, children and the enslaved, they were Timbuktu. The manuscripts and the mosques, the scholarly debates and the trade networks, these were created and sustained by ordinary people doing ordinary things, making daily choices about how to spend their time and resources, about what mattered and what did not. The city was not an abstraction, not just an idea or a symbol, but a living community where people loved and quarrelled, where they struggled and sometimes flourished, where they hoped for better futures and worried about present difficulties. To understand Timbuktu, we must remember the human element, the forgotten voices whose lives were as real and as valuable as those of the famous scholars whose names history preserved, whose contributions were essential even when they went unrecorded. Not everyone in Timbuktu or its surrounding regions embraced the city's scholarly culture, its Islamic orthodoxy, its integration into trans-Saharan trade networks. There was resistance, sometimes open, more often subtle, from those who had different visions of how society should be organized, who felt threatened by Timbuktu's power, who resented its wealth, who questioned its values. This opposition shaped the city's history as much as the more celebrated achievements of its scholars and merchants. The most obvious resistance came from religious conservatives, who believed Timbuktu's scholars had strayed from proper Islam, that their engagement with philosophy and mysticism, their preservation of texts that some considered heretical, their tolerance of syncretism with local African religions, all of this represented dangerous deviation. Soni Ali, the Songhai ruler who persecuted Timbuktu scholars in the late 15th century, justified his actions partly on religious grounds, claiming that the scholars were not truly Muslim, that they criticized his own religious practices unfairly, that they represented an elite class that looked down on common people and their traditions. This tension between elite Islam, literate and cosmopolitan and influenced by Middle Eastern traditions, and popular Islam, which blended Islamic practices with older African beliefs, with veneration of ancestors and consultation with diviners, with practices that Orthodox scholars considered un-Islamic. This tension was constant. The scholars preached against what they saw as heretical innovations, wrote fatwas condemning practices they considered incompatible with Islam. But these practices persisted because they met needs that formal Islam did not fully address, because they connected to older traditions that people were unwilling to abandon, because religion, in practice, is always syncretic, always mixing official doctrine with local adaptations. There was also economic resistance from those who felt excluded from or exploited by Timbuktu's trade networks. The city's prosperity depended on controlling trade routes, on taxing goods that passed through, on maintaining relationships with merchant networks that extended across the Sahara. This created winners and losers. Merchants who had access to these networks prospered. Those who were excluded, who lacked connections or capital, or the right religious and ethnic affiliations, struggled. Some turned to raiding, to attacking caravans, to trying to disrupt the trade that enriched Timbuktu but did not benefit them. The Tuareg nomads, who controlled much of the Saharan desert, were sometimes allies, providing protection for caravans, guiding traders across difficult terrain. But they were also sometimes enemies, demanding excessive payments, threatening violence, occasionally attacking and plundering caravans. Their resistance was pragmatic, driven by the desire to extract maximum benefit from the trade that crossed their territory, to maintain their own independence and power in a region where settled states like Mali and Songhai were trying to extend their control. Political resistance came from rival cities that competed with Timbuktu for trade and prestige. Jenne, located on another branch of the Niger River, was a major commercial centre with its own scholarly traditions. Gao, capital of the Songhai Empire, sought to rival Timbuktu intellectually as well as politically. Walata, an older city that had been a major trading centre before Timbuktu's rise, resented being eclipsed. These cities were not necessarily hostile. There was cooperation and exchange. Scholars moved between them. Trade connected them. But there was also competition for resources, for patronage, for recognition as the preeminent centre. Within Timbuktu itself, there were factions and rivalries, disputes between different scholarly families, between different Sufi orders, between those who favoured strict orthodoxy and those who were more flexible, between those who welcomed outside influence and those who feared it diluted local traditions. These disputes occasionally became violent, led to accusations of heresy, to conflicts that required political authorities to intervene. The city's intellectual life was not harmonious but contentious, full of debates that sometimes turned personal, of resentments that sometimes lasted generations. The most consequential resistance came from outside, from powers that saw Timbuktu's wealth and wanted to control it. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 was motivated primarily by desire for gold, for control of the trans-Saharan trade, for the wealth that would allow the Moroccan Sultan to strengthen his position in North African and Mediterranean politics. The Moroccan forces met some resistance. The Songhai army fought bravely at Tondibi, despite being outmatched technologically, but Timbuktu itself surrendered, hoping that submission would protect the city from destruction. The occupation that followed was a form of ongoing resistance, met with ongoing oppression. The scholars, those who had not fled or been arrested, engaged in what resistance they could. They preserved manuscripts, hiding them from confiscation. They maintained teaching, quietly continuing their work despite the disruption. They wrote chronicles that recorded the injustices of Moroccan rule, that preserved memory of what Timbuktu had been before the conquest. This was not violent resistance, but cultural resistance, the determination to survive, to maintain identity and traditions despite conquest and exploitation. European colonialism, when it came centuries later, brought a different kind of resistance. The French, who colonized Mali in the late 19th century, were not particularly interested in Timbuktu's intellectual heritage. They saw the manuscripts as curiosities, sometimes removed them to French archives, but did not support the scholarly traditions that had created them. Some local families resisted by hiding manuscripts, by refusing to cooperate with French scholars, by maintaining silence about what they possessed. This was resistance born of bitter experience, of knowing that outsiders often took rather than preserved, that cooperation often led to exploitation. In the 20th century, resistance took new forms. As African nationalism grew, as Mali moved toward independence, there were debates about how to relate to Timbuktu's heritage. Should it be emphasized, celebrated as proof of African achievement, or should it be seen as too tied to Islam, to Arab culture, as not sufficiently African, not representative of the diverse traditions of Mali? These debates reflected deeper questions about identity, about what it meant to be African in the post-colonial era, about how to honor the past while building a modern nation. The most recent resistance came from Islamist extremists who occupied Timbuktu in 2012 and 2013, who saw the manuscripts and the city's Sufi traditions as heretical, as un-Islamic, as deserving destruction. They burned manuscripts, destroyed shrines, imposed a harsh interpretation of Islamic law that bore no resemblance to Timbuktu's traditionally tolerant scholarship. This was resistance to modernity, to pluralism, to the very things that had made Timbuktu great. And it was met with resistance from local people who risked their lives to save manuscripts, who opposed the extremists however they could, who maintained hope that their city would be liberated and its traditions restored. Resistance, then, was not peripheral to Timbuktu's history but central to it. The city existed in tension between different visions of Islam, between different economic interests, between local and global, between preservation and change. The opposition shaped what Timbuktu became, forced it to adapt and defend itself, tested its resilience, and ultimately contributed to its decline when resistance became too powerful to overcome. But resistance also preserved something essential, the determination of people who believed their culture and knowledge mattered enough to fight for, to hide, to protect, even when the world seemed to have forgotten their value. There are moments in history when everything seems to align, when political stability and economic prosperity, when cultural confidence and intellectual ambition, when individual genius and institutional support all come together to create something extraordinary. For Timbuktu, this moment came in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, during the reign of Askia Muhammad and his immediate successors, a period of perhaps 60 years, when the city experienced a cultural renaissance that rivaled anything happening elsewhere in the world. The awakening was not sudden, but rather the culmination of decades of development, the flowering of seeds planted by Mansa Musa and cultivated by generations of scholars and patrons. But under Askia Muhammad, everything seemed to accelerate, to intensify, to reach a level of achievement that had not existed before and would not exist again. This was Timbuktu at its peak, the moment when the city fulfilled its promise, when it became truly what it had always aspired to be. The scholarly community expanded dramatically. The number of active scholars in the city may have reached several hundred, men who had mastered extensive curricula, who had studied with multiple teachers, who had earned ijazas in various subjects, who were now teaching their own students and writing their own works. These were not isolated individuals, but a community, connected by relationships of teacher and student, by scholarly debates, by shared participation in mosque universities, by family ties and friendships that created networks of intellectual exchange. The libraries grew more impressive. Private collections that had contained dozens or hundreds of manuscripts now held thousands. The great families of Timbuktu, whose wealth came from trade or from generations of scholarship, competed to build the most comprehensive collections, to acquire rare texts, to commission beautiful copies of important works. Books were still the most valuable possessions, worth more than livestock or real estate, and owning a major library brought prestige that money alone could not purchase. The subjects studied and taught became more diverse, more specialized, more sophisticated. While religious sciences, Quranic interpretation and hadith studies and Islamic law remained central, other fields flourished as well. Astronomy reached new heights, with scholars making their own observations, calculating prayer times with precision, creating star charts adapted to Timbuktu's latitude. Mathematics, particularly geometry and algebra, was taught not just from classical texts, but with original examples and applications. Logic and philosophy, subjects that some conservative scholars viewed with suspicion, were studied openly, with commentaries on Aristotle and debates about the relationship between reason and revelation. Medicine advanced through the combination of Islamic medical traditions with local African knowledge of plants and remedies. Timbuktu's physicians wrote texts describing diseases particular to the region, recommending treatments that drew on both imported and indigenous pharmacology. They performed surgeries, set bones, treated wounds, managed epidemics, developing expertise that was recognized across West Africa. Historical writing flourished as scholars began to systematically record the history of West African kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, the accomplishments of rulers and scholars. This was partly motivated by pride, by the desire to show that West Africa had a history worth recording, that African kings and scholars deserved to be remembered alongside their counterparts in other parts of the Islamic world. But it was also motivated by a sense that something important was happening, that this moment of cultural flowering deserved to be documented for future generations. Both Arabic and local languages used to create works that ranged from devotional verse to love poetry, from historical epics to satirical commentary on contemporary events. The poets of Timbuktu were accomplished in traditional Arabic poetic forms, but also innovated, creating new styles, incorporating African rhythms and themes, producing a literature that was Islamic but also distinctively West African. Sufi mysticism, which had always been present in Timbuktu, became more prominent and more sophisticated during this period. The Qadiriya order, which emphasized direct spiritual experience, attracted many adherents, including some of the city's leading scholars. Sufi texts were copied and studied. Practices like dhikr, collective remembrance of God, were performed in mosques and homes. Mystical poetry expressed yearning for divine union. This spiritual dimension coexisted with, and sometimes complemented, the formal scholarship, creating a culture that valued both intellectual rigor and personal piety, both rational inquiry and mystical experience. The city's physical appearance reflected this cultural confidence. The mosques, particularly Jingreba and Sankore, were maintained and beautified. New buildings were constructed, not just mosques but also libraries and schools, private homes for wealthy families that were more elaborate than earlier structures. The mud brick architecture, while still fundamentally simple, was refined, with better proportioning, with decorative elements, with attention to aesthetics as well as function. Ceremonies and festivals became more elaborate, more sophisticated, occasions for displaying wealth and learning, for bringing the community together, for celebrating Timbuktu's achievements. Religious holidays were marked with public gatherings, with recitations of poetry, with scholarly debates held in open spaces where ordinary people could observe and appreciate the intellectual culture even if they could not fully participate in it. The awakening was also characterized by openness, by cosmopolitanism, by the presence in Timbuktu of scholars from across West Africa, North Africa, and occasionally from further afield. The city became more international, more diverse, more engaged with the wider Islamic world. This exchange enriched Timbuktu's intellectual life, brought new ideas and perspectives, maintained connections that prevented the city from becoming provincial or isolated. But the Renaissance was fragile, dependent on conditions that could not be guaranteed to last. It required political stability, which depended on the strength of the Songhai Empire. It required economic prosperity, which depended on trade routes that could be disrupted. It required patronage, which depended on rulers who valued learning and had resources to support it. When these conditions changed, when the empire weakened and trade declined, when the Moroccan invasion brought violence and disruption, the Renaissance ended, not immediately but gradually, the bright flame dimming, the awakening fading back into sleep. But for those 60 years, Timbuktu was fully awake, fully alive, producing and preserving and transmitting knowledge at a level that justifies calling it one of the great intellectual centres of its time. The manuscripts that survive from this period, the works written by its scholars, the texts they copied and studied, all testify to an achievement that was remarkable and real, that deserves to be remembered and celebrated, that proves that cultural renaissance can happen anywhere, in any corner of the world, when circumstances allow genius to flourish and when people dare to reach for greatness. The deepest truth about Timbuktu, the revelation that emerges when you look past the romantic legends and the colonial dismissals, past the manuscripts and the mosques, past even the impressive achievements of its scholars, is a truth about knowledge itself, about what we value and what we preserve, about how civilizations are remembered and forgotten, about the lies we tell to justify power and the price humanity pays when we privilege some voices while silencing others. The revelation begins with a simple observation. Timbuktu's decline was not caused by intellectual failure, not by the inferiority of African minds or the inadequacy of Islamic scholarship. The city did not fall because its scholars stopped producing valuable work or because its students stopped learning. It fell because the systems that sustained it, the trade networks and political stability, the patronage and security, were destroyed by external forces, by Moroccan conquest motivated by greed, by the shift of global trade routes toward the Atlantic that marginalized trans-Saharan commerce, by European colonialism that had no interest in preserving African intellectual traditions. This matters because, for centuries, Timbuktu's decline was presented as evidence of natural limits, of the inability of African or Islamic civilizations to sustain themselves, of the inevitable superiority of European modernity. The ruined mud brick buildings, the scattered manuscripts, the poverty of the city when Europeans finally reached it, all of this was interpreted as proof that Timbuktu had never been as great as legends claimed, that whatever learning had existed was derivative and second-rate, that the city's reputation was inflated by African pride and romantic European imagination. But this interpretation was a lie, one designed to justify colonialism, to support narratives of European exceptionalism, to deny that Africans had created sophisticated civilizations that were destroyed not by their own inadequacy, but by external violence and exploitation. The revelation is that Timbuktu's fall teaches us nothing about African capacity and everything about the fragility of intellectual culture, about how easily knowledge can be lost, about how conquest and economic disruption can destroy in years what took centuries to build. The manuscripts themselves reveal this truth. They are not primitive or crude. They are sophisticated works of scholarship, showing mastery of complex subjects, engagement with ongoing intellectual debates, original contributions to various fields. When you read a Timbuktu manuscript on astronomy or law, on medicine or theology, you are reading work that is comparable to what was being produced in Cairo or Damascus, in Cordoba or Baghdad. The quality is there, undeniable, documented in thousands of texts that have survived despite every effort to destroy or discredit them. It is about what colonialism did to knowledge itself, about how the suppression of African intellectual history impoverished everyone, not just Africans. When Timbuktu's manuscripts were ignored or dismissed, when African scholarly traditions were erased from world history, humanity lost access to knowledge that could have been valuable, to perspectives that could have enriched understanding, to evidence of human creativity and adaptation that could have challenged narrow assumptions about who creates civilization and how. The medical manuscripts, for instance, contain knowledge of African plants and their medicinal properties, information that could have contributed to global pharmacology. The astronomical observations, made from latitudes rarely studied by other medieval astronomers, could have added to understanding of celestial mechanics. The historical chronicles preserve information about African kingdoms and trade networks that is available nowhere else. All of this was ignored, dismissed as unimportant or unreliable, lost to scholarship for centuries. The revelation is also about the mechanism of erasure, about how easily dominant narratives can obscure inconvenient truths. European colonizers needed to believe that they were bringing civilization to Africa, that Africans had no history worth preserving, no cultures worth respecting. Acknowledging Timbuktu's intellectual achievements would have undermined this narrative, would have raised uncomfortable questions about who the real barbarians were. So Timbuktu was rewritten, transformed from a center of learning into a mysterious city of gold, then into a disappointing collection of mud huts, finally into a footnote in world history, mentioned but not taken seriously. This erasure was systematic and deliberate. French colonial authorities in Mali knew about the manuscripts. Some French scholars studied them. But this knowledge was not widely disseminated, not incorporated into standard histories, not taught in schools even in France, let alone in the colonies. The assumption was that African history was not really history, that it did not matter to the larger human story, that it could be safely ignored without significant loss. But the families who preserved the manuscripts knew better. They maintained their libraries through poverty and warfare, through colonialism and independence, through periods when the manuscripts seemed to have no value to anyone but themselves. They did this because they understood something essential, that knowledge is heritage, that books are ancestors speaking, that preserving these texts was preserving identity, maintaining connection to a past when their people had been respected, when Timbuktu had mattered, when scholarship had brought honour. The revelation accelerated in recent decades as the manuscripts began to be studied seriously, as digitization made them accessible to scholars worldwide, as African historians took control of their own narratives. What emerged was undeniable. Timbuktu had been extraordinary, its scholars had been accomplished, its intellectual culture had been sophisticated and productive. The lies could no longer be sustained, the evidence was too strong, the manuscripts too numerous and too impressive. But even now, even with the evidence available, the revelation is incomplete. Many people still do not know about Timbuktu's intellectual heritage, still carry unconscious assumptions about African inferiority, still see African history as marginal to world history. The work of correction, of education, of changing how history is taught and understood, this work is ongoing and far from finished. The deepest revelation, then, is about power and knowledge, about how those who control the present try to control the past, about how history is weaponized to justify oppression, about how recovering suppressed truths is an act of resistance and liberation. Timbuktu's manuscripts are not just historical documents. They are evidence in an ongoing trial, proof that the stories told by colonialism were lies, that African achievement is real and substantial, that knowledge has never belonged exclusively to any race or region, but has always been the common project of humanity. When Islamist extremists burned Timbuktu's manuscripts in 2013, when they destroyed shrines and banned music, when they tried to erase the city's intellectual and spiritual traditions, they were continuing colonialism's work, were trying to impose a single narrow vision of what Islam and Africa should be, were rejecting the pluralism and tolerance that had characterized Timbuktu's golden age. And when local people risked their lives to save the manuscripts, smuggling them to safety in metal trunks and rice bags, hiding them in basements and caves, they were resisting not just extremism but the entire history of erasure, were insisting that Timbuktu's heritage mattered enough to die for. The revelation is that knowledge is power, that controlling what is known and remembered is as important as controlling territory or resources, that the battle over Timbuktu's manuscripts is part of a larger battle over who gets to define reality, who gets to write history, whose achievements get celebrated and whose get forgotten. And the revelation is that this battle is not over, that every generation must fight it anew, must resist the erasure, must insist on truth even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges cherished narratives, even when it requires admitting that what we thought we knew was wrong. Timbuktu teaches us that civilizations are fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that what seems permanent can be destroyed. But it also teaches us that knowledge can be recovered, that truth persists, that manuscripts hidden in trunks for centuries can still speak, that the determination of ordinary people to preserve their heritage can outlast empires and ideologies. The deepest revelation is one of hope, that even when the world forgets, even when powerful forces work to erase, even when everything seems lost, knowledge survives, truth endures, and eventually, if we work hard enough, if we care enough, the forgotten can be remembered and the silenced can speak again. There is something haunting about the story of Timbuktu, something that lingers in the mind long after the historical details fade, something that speaks to fundamental questions about what we value as individuals and as societies, about how we define progress and civilization, about what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. The city forces us to reflect, to examine our assumptions, to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we have inherited and the narratives we have been taught. What does Timbuktu mean for us, living now, in an age when information is abundant but wisdom seems scarce, when books are everywhere but reading declines, when knowledge is instantly accessible, yet somehow more fragile than ever? It means, first, that we must reconsider what we think we know about Africa, about Islam, about the medieval world, about the geography of civilization itself. For too long, history has been taught as if civilization moved in a single direction, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and Rome, to medieval Europe, and then to the modern West, with brief acknowledgements of China and India, but with Africa largely absent, except as a recipient of outside influences or as a source of slaves and raw materials. Timbuktu demolishes this narrative. It proves that sophisticated intellectual culture flourished in West Africa, that African scholars participated in global networks of knowledge, that learning crossed the Sahara as readily as gold and salt, that civilization was never confined to the regions and peoples we have been taught to celebrate. This matters because narratives shape possibilities. When African children learn that their ancestors built nothing, achieved nothing, contributed nothing to world civilization, it damages their sense of self, limits their imagination about what they might achieve. When the world learns that Africa has intellectual traditions, that Africans created universities and libraries, that black scholars mastered astronomy and law and medicine, it challenges racist assumptions that persist, even among people who would never consider themselves prejudiced. Timbuktu also challenges our assumptions about what constitutes wealth and success. The city's scholars believed that books were more valuable than gold, that knowledge brought more honor than material possessions, that a life spent in study and teaching was the highest calling. This is profoundly countercultural in our age of consumption, of measuring worth by wealth, of valuing celebrity over scholarship, of treating education as primarily a means to economic advancement rather than as intrinsically valuable. The reflection deepens when we consider what was lost and why. Timbuktu declined, not because learning became less valued by the people who lived there, but because external forces, conquest and economic disruption and colonial indifference, destroyed the systems that sustained intellectual life. This is a warning about the fragility of culture, about how political instability and violence can destroy irreplaceable knowledge, about how easily the work of centuries can be undone in years. We see this pattern repeated across history. The Library of Alexandria destroyed by fire, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad sacked by Mongols, European monasteries dissolved and their libraries scattered, Chinese imperial libraries burned during the Cultural Revolution. Knowledge is always vulnerable to those who fear it, who see it as threatening, who value immediate power over long-term wisdom. Timbuktu is one example among many, but it is particularly poignant because the destruction was so complete, the recovery so difficult, the erasure so deliberate. But Timbuktu also offers hope. The evidence that knowledge can survive against improbable odds, that people will risk everything to preserve what they believe matters, that manuscripts hidden in trunks can outlast empires, that truth, however suppressed, eventually demands to be heard. The families who maintained libraries for generations without institutional support, without recognition, sometimes without even full understanding of what they possessed, they performed an act of faith, believing that someday these books would matter again, that the world would remember Timbuktu's glory. This hope is not naive or easy. It requires effort, sacrifice, the willingness to fight against powerful forces that benefit from ignorance and erasure. The digitization of Timbuktu's manuscripts, the effort to preserve them and make them accessible, is ongoing and requires resources that Mali, one of the world's poorest countries, struggles to provide. International support helps, but also raises questions about ownership and control, about who benefits from this heritage, about whether making manuscripts available globally serves or undermines the communities that preserved them. The reflection must also confront our own complicity in systems that continue to marginalize African knowledge and history. How many history classes teach about Timbuktu with the same depth they teach about Athens or Rome? How many universities offer courses on West African intellectual history? How many people outside Africa can name even one Timbuktu scholar? The erasure is not complete. Progress has been made, but it is far from finished. Timbuktu challenges us to think about the relationship between knowledge and power in our own time. We live in an age when information is manipulated, when facts are contested, when expertise is dismissed, when libraries and schools are underfunded while weapons receive unlimited resources. We live in an age when books are still burned, when scholars are still persecuted, when the powerful still fear knowledge because educated people are harder to control. Timbuktu reminds us that this is not new, that the battle over knowledge is ancient and ongoing, that every generation must choose whether to preserve and expand human understanding or to narrow and restrict it. And Timbuktu challenges us personally, asks us what we value, what we are willing to sacrifice for, what we want to leave behind. The scholars who dedicated their lives to copying and studying manuscripts, who lived simply so they could devote themselves to learning, who believed that knowledge was its own reward, they made choices that seem almost incomprehensible in our age of constant distraction and instant gratification. But their work survived, their names are remembered, their contributions matter. How many of us can say our work will matter in 500 years? The reflection, finally, is about shared humanity, about the universal human impulse to learn and teach, to record and preserve, to understand and explain. The scholars of Timbuktu ask the same questions scholars everywhere ask: what is true? What is beautiful? What is just? How should we live? What endures? Their answers, shaped by Islam and Africa, by specific times and places and circumstances, were their own. But the questions are universal. Their dedication to seeking answers is universal, and recognizing this universality challenges the divisions we create, the hierarchies we impose, the boundaries we draw between us and them. Timbuktu means that we must see the world more completely, more honestly, more generously. It means acknowledging achievements we have ignored, honouring voices we have silenced, learning histories we have been taught to dismiss. It means recognising that civilization is not a Western invention or an Eastern tradition, but a human capacity, emerging wherever people have resources and stability and the freedom to think and create. And it means committing ourselves to preservation, to education, to the belief that knowledge matters, that truth matters, that the work of scholars writing by lamplight in a desert city 500 years ago still speaks to us today, still teaches us, still challenges us to be better than we are. The sun sets over Timbuktu as it has set for centuries, the light turning the mud, brick walls golden, casting long shadows across sandy streets, illuminating the minarets of mosques that have stood since the Golden Age. The city is quieter now than it was in its prime, smaller, less prosperous, marked by poverty and by the scars of recent conflict. But it endures, as it has always endured, adapting to each new challenge, preserving what can be preserved, carrying forward traditions that connect the present to a past when this place mattered deeply to the wider world. The legacy of Timbuktu is written in stone, in the mosques that still stand, restored and maintained through international cooperation and local dedication. Dengreba, with its distinctive minaret and its massive walls, still serves as a place of worship, still gathers the community for Friday prayers, still teaches Quranic verses to children who sit where scholars once debated philosophy and law. Sankore, once the heart of the university, has been rebuilt after damage from weather and warfare, its courtyards again filled with students, though fewer than in the Golden Age. Sidi Yahya, the third great mosque, maintains its traditions, its connection to generations of worship and scholarship. These buildings, made of earth and needing constant maintenance, are not monuments in the European sense, not stone structures that can survive centuries of neglect. They require active care, annual replastering, repairs after every rainy season, the work of specialists who understand traditional building techniques, who use local materials, who maintain continuity with the past while adapting to present needs. This ongoing maintenance is itself a tradition, a way of keeping the past alive, of ensuring that Timbuktu remains connected to its heritage. But the legacy is more powerfully preserved in memory, in the manuscripts that survived fire and theft, warfare and neglect, that are now stored in climate-controlled libraries and in private family collections, that are being digitized and studied, catalogued and translated, slowly revealing their secrets to scholars from around the world. These manuscripts are Timbuktu's true monuments, more durable than mud brick, more eloquent than any building, speaking directly across centuries to anyone willing to listen. The work of preservation continues. The Ahmed Baba Institute, rebuilt after being burned by extremists in 2013, houses tens of thousands of manuscripts. Private libraries maintained by families like the Kati and the Haidara preserve tens of thousands more. International organizations support conservation efforts, fund digitization projects, train local people in manuscript preservation. This is painstaking work, each manuscript requiring careful handling, each page needing to be photographed and catalogued, the ink and paper analyzed, the content transcribed and translated. The legacy is also carried by the descendants of Timbuktu's scholars, families who maintained libraries for generations, who remember ancestor scholars, who tell stories of the Golden Age, who take pride in their heritage despite centuries of decline and dismissal. For these families, the manuscripts are not just historical documents but family treasures, proof of their ancestors' achievements, tangible connections to a time when their family names commanded respect, when scholarship brought honour. And the legacy lives in Timbuktu's role as symbol, as icon of African achievement and potential. For Mali, Timbuktu is a source of national pride. Evidence that the country has a glorious past, that Malians are heirs to a great civilization. The manuscripts appear on currency, the mosques on stamps, The city's name invokes a golden age that modern Mali aspires to honour and perhaps someday to match. For Africa more broadly, Timbuktu is proof that the continent has intellectual traditions, that African history is not just about slavery and colonialism, that Africans created universities and libraries when much of Europe was illiterate. For the world, Timbuktu has become emblematic of cultural heritage at risk, of knowledge threatened by violence and neglect, of the importance of preservation. The dramatic rescue of manuscripts during the extremist occupation, when librarians smuggled thousands of texts to safety in metal trunks and rice bags, became international news. A story of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of cultural heroism. The fundraising campaigns that followed, the international support for preservation, reflected a growing recognition that Timbuktu's heritage belongs not just to Mali or Africa, but to all humanity. But the legacy is fragile, threatened by poverty and climate change, by political instability and religious extremism, by the simple fact that mud, brick and paper are not permanent materials. The desert is encroaching, sand dunes threatening buildings, climate change making rainfall more erratic, the Niger River less reliable. The manuscripts, despite best efforts, are deteriorating, ink fading, paper crumbling, some too fragile to handle safely. Time is working against preservation, and the race to digitize, to record, to save what can be saved is urgent. Tourism, which could provide resources for preservation, has been devastated by security concerns, by kidnappings, and attacks that have made Timbuktu dangerous for foreign visitors. The hotels are empty, the guides unemployed, the income that might support conservation has dried up. The city struggles economically, young people leave for opportunities elsewhere, the population ages, traditions weaken. The legacy endures, but the city that created it suffers. Yet there is hope, stubborn and defiant, in the scholars who continue their work, in the families who maintain libraries, in the children who still learn to read Arabic in Quranic schools, in the determination of Malians to preserve their heritage despite every obstacle. There is hope in the growing recognition of Timbuktu's importance, in the increasing inclusion of African history in world history curricula, in the scholarship being produced by a new generation of African historians who are reclaiming their past, telling their own stories, challenging the narratives imposed by colonialism. The legacy of Timbuktu, finally, is a question posed to the future. What will we preserve? What will we value? What knowledge will we fight to save? The manuscripts survived because people believed they mattered enough to hide, to protect, to risk punishment or death for. The mosques survive because communities maintain them, replaster them every year, keep them alive through constant care. The memory survives because it is told and retold, because it is taught to children, because it refuses to be forgotten. And so Timbuktu endures, not frozen in some imagined golden age, but living, changing, adapting, carrying forward traditions while facing new challenges. The city that was once the intellectual heart of West Africa, that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, that valued books above gold, that proved that African genius could create centers of learning to rival any on earth. This city still stands, dusty and diminished perhaps, but dignified, proud, still speaking to those who will listen. The sun has set, the city darkens, the mosques fade into shadow, but the legacy remains, written in manuscripts and memory, in mud brick, and in the determination of people who refuse to let their heritage die. Timbuktu's golden age may be past, but its story continues, its lessons endure, its challenge persists, to value knowledge, to preserve wisdom, to recognize that civilization blooms wherever humans dare to read and write and think, wherever they choose learning over ignorance, wherever they build libraries instead of monuments to power. That is Timbuktu's legacy, and it belongs to all of us, waiting to be claimed, calling us to remember, to honor, to carry forward the conviction that in the end, knowledge is the only true wealth, the only treasure that cannot be stolen, the only monument that time cannot destroy.